Hi, my name is Arsh, and today we're going to be covering how to use Infisical, which is a secure credential solution to help you secure secrets, certificates, and your access management across all of your Azure infrastructure. So with Infisical, some of the things to note here are that we can actually set up these separate projects within the platform to help you manage your secure credentials for things like secrets, your certificates, SSH certificates, encryption keys, and also privileged access management. So with these projects, depending on the type of credential you're looking to manage, we can set up different credential project types, right? So we'll mainly start with secrets management here and also cover certificate management. But as mentioned, there's other product lines that can help you support your Azure infrastructure use cases here. But with a secrets project, to give you an overview of what kind of project we're going to be using to manage our secrets within Azure as well. You will have these secrets projects that have a logical environment-based separation here, right? So we have development, staging, production core, and then 3 regional production environments between the US, EU, and Australia. Now, we can actually set up these separate environments to have different folders and nested sets of secrets under each. And this also includes automatically rotating secrets and dynamic credentials for things like SQL databases or Azure Entra ID, Azure SQL databases as well. So different types of credentials that we can actually then use to push forward and use within our Azure infrastructure. But once you have your secrets within Infisical, right, you have your environments built out, we can then move towards actually sending these to Azure, right? And there's a couple different models we could follow there. So we can go to integrations here, and under secret syncs, you'll find some of our different integration methods here. So within integrations, one thing to note that there is that, with things like Azure App Configurations, Azure DevOps, Azure Key Vault, GitHub, we have different types of integration methods to follow here. So one of these methods is this push-based integration, where we can sync certain environments or folder paths within Infisical to certain paths within, let's say, Azure Key Vault, for example, right? Or to this secure storage of Azure DevOps. And so there's different mappings we can set up, more of this one-to-one relationship or many-to-one, where we might only want to push dev credentials or a certain subfolder of production to Azure Key Vault, for example. But essentially, we would be setting up this synchronization so that anytime a secret is updated within Infisical, any of the varying places you need that secret to be delivered will automatically be synchronized. So that's one sort of integration we can take here, this one integration method. And the other integration method is more of this pull type of integration, right? Actually authenticating to Infisical and fetching. And there's a couple of different things we can actually take advantage of there with more of this fetch integration. One of those being that with things like Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions, for example, we can actually, for Azure DevOps, natively authenticate using an Azure Service Principal based auth, or with GitHub Actions, natively authenticate with OIDC, so that we now are actually not having to secure those root credentials to actually access our secrets in the first place, avoiding something we call the secret zero problem, where you now have your set of credentials that help you access the rest of your credentials in your secret store, but how do you actually go about actually securing those credentials now? So in this case, what we can do is instead make it more identity-based with Azure Auth or OIDC-based auth, and actually authenticate to Infisical and then pull those secrets in during that pipeline's runtime. So those credentials will exist as long as that Azure DevOps pipeline exists, or as long as that GitHub action exists. And they can even pull in dynamic secrets as well, so generate secrets to exist for the duration of that pipeline's runtime for things like Postgres databases and Entra ID, as we've covered. But those secrets won't be written long-term anywhere. They'll just be pulled in as needed. So with Infisical, just to recap, we can actually follow more of this synchronization-based approach or this pull-based approach. And how we actually enable these integrations is through the use of app connections. So with app connections, Here you can see we have an Azure app configuration connection set up already to actually give us permissions using OAuth to actually go and make changes within our Azure infrastructure. But we can also set it up for, as you saw with the other integrations, client secrets, Azure DevOps, Azure Key Vault, or GitHub as well. And these app connections are what actually enable us to go and manage your Azure resources. So I can walk you through what setting up one of these integrations look like here. So let's say we wanted to synchronize secrets to Azure app configurations. We can select Azure app configuration sync here. Select the source environment where we want to sync secrets from. So let's say we're trying to set up more development secrets. We can, from the root path here, we can move on to next. And here we select that test application Azure app configuration connection that we had set up earlier. And then here we can specify a test resource.azconfig.io, just as an example to show you how we would set up one of these syncs. And we can also specify labels, for the Azure app configuration here if we wanted to label something like Infisical here, but we'll avoid that for now. Move on to next. The initial sync behavior is actually, how do we want this initial setup to work? Do we want to overwrite any secrets that might exist in Azure Key Vault or Azure app configuration in this instance? Or would we like to import those destination secrets, right? And in the imports, in that one-time import, we're actually importing any secrets that already exist there. We can also decide to prioritize one value or the other, right? So if we have two matching keys in both Infisical and the Azure app configuration with different values, which value are we going to prioritize? Are we prioritizing the ones in Infisical or the ones in Azure app config? So we can specify the initial sync behavior, also a key schema if there's only a certain number of secrets or a certain format of secrets we want to manage with Infisical, and go on to next, right? And we can actually name this sync and then go ahead and create it. But for the purpose of this demo, we won't be creating it here. So that's how we set up the integrations. But within access controls is where we would use things like Azure Entra ID, for example. With Azure Entra ID, we can set up that as our primary identity source. So now that now Entra ID is our source of truth, and anytime users are provisioned in Entra ID, they'll be automatically provisioned within Infisical. And we can also sync Entra ID groups and map the right permissions there. So with something like skim provisioning, we're actually not having to manage users in Infisical, but we just use Entra ID as our source of truth. And speaking of machine identities, so with machine identities, what we're able to do is create, for example, an Azure DevOps identity, where this identity will now use to, for example, manage those integrations, those pull-based integrations we were discussing within the Azure integrations for Azure DevOps. And here's how we would set up Azure Native Auth. So we can specify the tenant ID, the specific resource or audience, what specific service principal IDs we want to allow using this identity, so we can scope it down even further, as well as the access token TTL and max TTL limits here. And if this is going to be a limited use identity and we actually want to scope down how many uses it can have, we can scope that here. And advanced is where we would even get more granular with our permissioning and specify what IP addresses we want to use here. But what this allows us to do now is, once again, use more identity-based authentication instead of credential-based authentication and take advantage of identities and service principals that already exist in Azure. Now, on top of the secrets management and a lot of your authentication and access controls here, within our PKI product, you'll see that we can also help you to, within Azure Directory certificate services, to issue and manage those certificates. And how we do that is setting up these external certificate authorities, where here we can actually specify that we want to use Azure AD certificate service as our external CA. And so we can set up, once again, a Azure Active Directory certificate services app connection. That'll allow us to set up our permissioning so then we can now manage certificates within Azure, and select that connection here to actually enable your external CA. And once external CAs are set up, we can set up the subscribers to actually be able to go and consume and issue certificates. So I hope today's walkthrough kind of showed, how Infisical can be used to not only manage secrets, but also certificates and your access controls and authentication within Azure. Thank you.